Welcome to this special series of in-depth political interviews Revelation TV is doing for the general election on Thursday the 8th of June. And in today's programme I'm interviewing the Right Honourable Michael Gove for the Conservative Party. Michael Gove, it's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to interview you today for the general election, which is on Thursday the 8th of June. You are by far one of the most gifted politicians of your generation and serving at the highest level of office. Can you share with our viewers how much your Christian faith has had an impact on your politics?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you and to your viewers today. And I think if I look back on the time that I spent in politics, one of the things that inevitably affects me is my outlook on the world, on individual human beings, which has been shaped by being brought up as a Christian and by being a Christian today. And of course, I wouldn't want to make any superior claim as someone who's a Christian that I have been privileged to have an insight or to be capable of bringing to the job of being a politician any better claim than anyone else. But I do think that there are certain moments when I was Justice Secretary thinking about rehabilitation, when I was Education Secretary thinking about how we improve social work, when a particular insight which I definitely draw from my faith was very powerful, and that was the belief that every single soul is precious. Every human being is of worth, and that individuals, whether they're people who've found themselves entangled in the criminal justice system or people who are growing up in desperate and difficult circumstances, they all deserve our care and attention. They're all of equal value.
And Mike, I have to ask you, why did you choose to join the Conservative Party?
Well, I grew up in Scotland, and the natural home for most people in politics at the time that I was growing up was the Labour Party. But I felt that the Labour Party tended to take people for granted, and I felt that the Conservative Party, particularly during the 1980s, was a party that was prepared to challenge some of the outdated orthodoxies and push for change. And I also felt that the Conservative Party was more interested in making sure that individuals, whatever their background, had an opportunity to chart and to shape their own destiny. And it seemed to me to be a compelling way of reshaping our country for the better to join the Conservative Party.
And within the Conservative Party, how much freedom do you have to express your Christian faith, particularly when it comes to issues of voting on issues of conscience?
Well, the Conservative Party, and I think almost all of the major political parties represented in the House of Commons, do allow individual representatives to vote on conscience issues, on end-of-life issues, on some of these big moral questions in a way that is entirely free of any party whipping and entirely consistent with their conscience. More than that, though, you've got to recognise that there are people of good conscience who will disagree on some of these issues. And the main thing to do is to ensure that whether it's an argument within a party or between parties, that it's conducted in a civilised way. And I've been struck by the fact that even though politics excites passion, most of the conversations that I've had with political colleagues about some of these very big and sensitive subjects have been conducted with civility and consideration and a willingness to see the other person's point of view.
Now, in terms of Brexit, you, together with Boris Johnson, were essentially the leaders of the Leave campaign last year. So we have you and Boris to thank for pretty much securing our freedom and our withdrawal from the European Union. During that campaign, why did you decide to campaign for the Leave campaign, knowing that you have a close personal friendship with the then Prime Minister David Cameron?
Well, it was one of the most difficult decisions I've had to take in my life, because I knew that by following my heart and by arguing for us to leave the European Union, I would be disappointing and putting myself at odds with lots of dear friends. But ultimately, if you're a front-rank politician, as I was at the time, if you're in the cabinet, you can't duck a question like that. And so I asked myself, if in a generation's time I look back, would I think better or worse of myself for having been on either side of that argument? And I thought that Britain's membership of the European Union, while it had been born in idealism, had become an encumbrance. It had become, inimical to the spirit of democracy that had contributed to Britain's success in the past. And I felt reluctantly but firmly that it was right to leave. And once I made the decision that we should leave and that the attempts to reform the European Union had not succeeded, I felt that I had to make the argument in the best way that I could.
And last year you stood for the leadership of the Conservative Party and also potentially the country as well. Why did you make that decision?
Well, I felt that at the time that we needed to have someone taking Britain out of the European Union who'd argued that Britain should leave. Actually, with the benefit of hindsight, I think the country was lucky. We were blessed that Theresa May became Prime Minister, because even though Theresa was reluctantly in favour of us remaining, she's actually shown that she's got the strength to be able to take this country out of the European Union, but also the breadth of sympathy to be able to unite people who were both in favour of remaining and keen to leave behind a Brexit agenda.
Now, Theresa May is our Prime Minister, and she's obviously a cabinet colleague of yours under David Cameron. What is Theresa May like, and what leadership qualities does she have?
Well, Theresa's a formidable public servant. I mean, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that she grew up with her own father as a vicar, seeing what it was to be devoted to an ethic of service. And she's drawn to politics because it's a way of putting herself at the service of others. She's dogged and determined. She's the sort of person who prefers detail rather than glamour, who prefers slogging through the footnotes to appearing in front of the footlights. And she's also someone who is uniquely conscientious in wanting to make sure that she is the mistress of every detail, so that when she comes to a particular decision, it will be one which will benefit the country and one which she can defend and feel proud of having introduced.
This year's general election has been dubbed the Brexit election. What is the Conservative plans for Brexit, and what are the difficulties in terms of negotiating our withdrawal from the European Union?
Well, Theresa's been very clear, I think, about what the core elements of Britain leaving the European Union should be. We take back control of our laws by leaving the single market. We take back control of our trade deals by leaving the customs union. We take back control of our money by making sure that the money that we currently send to the EU is back in our hands. Now, one of the obstacles, of course, is that there may be EU nations that don't necessarily want a smooth passage towards our leaving the EU. But I think it's ultimately in both our interests, both Britain and the EU's, that we make this departure work so that we can then be strong partners in the future.
Now, isn't a major problem in terms of negotiating our exit is the fact that the British economy, our political system has been entangled with that of the European Union for the past 40 years or so, and that, however, there might be individual member states such as Germany that want a good trade deal, particularly because we buy so many of their luxury cars.
Absolutely.
But the European Union itself and the European Commission will want to punish Britain or to discourage other member states from leaving the EU.
I think it's certainly the case that there are some European politicians who want to try to punish the UK as they see it. But the rational self-interest of most of the European countries is to secure that good trade deal, and I think that will triumph in the end.
You were Minister for Justice in that situation. You have to deal with the European Court of Human Rights and what have you. You have probably a better perspective than most about the authoritarian nature of the European Union and its movement towards a European superstate. So do you believe if we didn't get a referendum last year on our membership, that sooner or later the British people would have to decide whether they'd be in a United States of Europe or not? Absolutely.
One of the things that became clear is that David Cameron was trying to persuade the other countries of Europe that the path towards integration, greater federalism, was a mistake, and they said, no, we want to carry on down this path. Now, we might be prepared to make an exception for you here or there, but our destiny is ever closer union. And I think in that sense, Britain made a judgment to leave at the right time, because if we'd stayed in, then we would have been told, well, you've had your vote, you've decided to stay, and therefore that means that you should keep quiet for the rest of our journey towards this destination, which is closer integration.
And Michael, do you believe that in this election, particularly with Theresa May being a very strong, certainly being a very strong Prime Minister, the likes that we haven't seen since the likes of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, that she is the best placed person to get the best deal possible from our withdrawal from the European Union in comparison to other political leaders that are standing in this election?
I think one of the things that's striking about this election is that there's nobody who says that anyone standing is tougher, more determined or a better negotiator than Theresa May. And I think that whether people voted to leave or to remain, our prospects are stronger in Theresa's hands than they would be in anyone else's.
In terms of issue that is really affecting a lot of our viewers, and a lot of viewers feel very concerned about this, and this is the growing social and political marginalisation of Christians in this country, and particularly those Christians who feel that they are being persecuted at work if they share their faith, or if they pray with a colleague or a patient, that they become dismissed at their jobs. What is the Conservative Party doing to protect core Christian freedoms in this country?
Well, Theresa May has made clear from the dispatch box in the House of Commons that people should not be ashamed, indeed they should be proud of their Christian faith, and that everything should be done which is possible to ensure that if people want to show their faith and to demonstrate the change that it's made in their life in the workplace or anywhere else, that they should be applauded for doing so. And it's critical that we recognise, whether or not people profess a Christian faith or not, that the foundation of our civilization is Judeo-Christian, and that respect for that faith, even if you don't share it, is essential to making sure that this country can continue to flourish and succeed, and at the same time be a warm and welcoming home for people of other faiths.
In terms of the economy now, the coalition government that you were very much part of, and one of the leaders in that, the major priority for David Cameron's government at that time, wasn't it, to actually reduce the deficit and balance the books. Is this still a priority for this Conservative government?
Yes, it's absolutely a priority to make sure that we can get back to economic health by balancing the books. But of course, one of the things that we mustn't do is to do it at such a breakneck speed that we risk public services en route. I think that between the desire of some people to slash public spending dramatically and the desire of the Labour Party to allow it to grow hugely, the Conservative approach of bringing the deficit down step by step, I think, is the right balanced approach.
In this election so far, Theresa May has announced that she wants to pursue new rights for workers to take time off to look after sick relatives, which is a good policy in itself. But considering that your party is the party of enterprise and small businesses, won't this hurt small businesses?
I don't think so, no, because I think it's important to recognise that business success depends on a broader set of values that underpin commercial enterprise. And one of those is respect for the family, an understanding of the importance of the social alongside the economic. And I think Theresa has that balance right. We will have low corporation tax. That will be an incentive for people to allow their enterprises to grow and to hire more workers. But it's also the case that we need to recognise that there are certain points in people's lives, following a bereavement or when a relative is ill, when it's absolutely right that we should put family first.
Now, I'm on to one of your pet subjects now, and that's the subject of education. Michael, now as Secretary of State for Education, you pioneered radical reforms within education to drive up standards to compete with those nations like Southeast Asia. What is the Conservative Party doing in terms of raising standards so that we are actually competitive in a global world?
Well, we've made some significant changes in the past. We've changed the curriculum to embody a higher level of ambition. We've made exams tougher and more rigorous so that we can compete with countries in Southeast Asia which are currently ahead of our own. And that means that young people will have the opportunity to take the university places or to pursue the apprenticeships that will guarantee prosperity. And one of the things we'll be doing in the next few years is investing more in technical education and also making sure that no school loses funding. And the announcement in the Conservative Manifesto this week will confirm that we'll continue that investment in schools, which will drive up standards even further.
One of Theresa May's passion is to reinstate grammar schools, or certainly to expand grammar school. Is that something that you endorse and support?
Yes, when I was Education Secretary, we increased selection at the age of 16. I think where there is a clear demand for additional grammar school provision and where the case can be made on the facts, then of course we must respond to parental wishes and to the evidence.
Now, on the issue of kind of home ownership, now the cost of property in London and South East is quite ridiculous, particularly for first-time buyers as well, trying to get on the property market. What policies have the Conservative Party put in place that is going to help first-time buyers achieve their dream of owning their own home?
Well, the main thing that we'll be doing is making sure that there are more homes which are built, homes for rent and homes to buy. And we're also extending the right to buy so that some of those new homes which are built, council houses for rent, will in due course be available for people to buy. So by increasing the number of homes available, we hope to make it easier for people to get a roof over their head, ideally to buy, but in the first place in many cases to rent.
One of the main reasons why so many of the British people decided to vote to leave the European Union was because of the mass immigration that we've had over the last few decades and the impact that that's had on many local communities. What is the Conservative plan to actually reduce net immigration into this country?
Well, by leaving the European Union, we'll have control over the number of people who come here from European countries, and we'll also be able to escape from under the rules of European courts, which have restricted some of the provisions we wanted to put in place in order to limit numbers. And the plan is to get it down to a sustainable level, to tens of thousands. And I think it's right that we should continue to welcome people who can make a contribution, but we need to do so in a way that is sustainable and balanced.
In terms of defence, now defence has become a major issue in this general election so far, primarily because of Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Trident views. How important is our national defence, Trident, and also support for NATO, particularly at this time where we're seeing a rise of Russian military activity in Eastern Europe on its former states that were part of the Soviet Union?
Well, the world is an uncertain place, perhaps more uncertain than it's been for several years, which is why you need strong leadership, which Theresa May provides. You also need investment in defence, and that's why I don't think we can afford to lower our guard. We know that Vladimir Putin and his Russia is an aggressive power. We also know that the threat from Islamist terrorism is growing, and we need to be ready to beat that and to meet it wherever it is threatening us.
In terms of the Islamist terrorist threat that we're facing, and yesterday it was Al-Qaeda, today it's ISIS, what is the British government's policy for confronting this rise of Islamic terrorist attacks that we're seeing not only here in Britain but sadly right across Europe as well in recent years?
I think we need to do two things. The one thing is that we need to make sure that we continue to invest in our intelligence and security services who enable us to interdict plots and to prevent things, atrocities happening before they occur. I think the other thing that we need to do is that we also need to be robust in defence of Western values and make it clear that our attachment to democracy and to liberalism is absolute, because this is both a technical battle against those who wish us harm physically, but it's also an ideological battle against people whose totalitarian vision is inimical to freedom.
Do you think that the internet giants such as Google, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube can play a major role in stopping the spread of this hatred that we're seeing online that is actually radicalising many of these young impressionable Muslims to carry out Islamic terrorist attacks?
Absolutely. I'm very strongly in favour of tech companies playing their part. Of course, I support free speech, but the important thing to recognise is that tech companies do have a responsibility sometimes to ensure that voices of hate are properly policed, and also that information which can help apprehend those who wish us harm and who are engaged in criminal activity is in the hands of those who can keep us safe.
And when it comes down to the actual terrorists that have already been radicalised and they've gone to join ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, and now are finding their way back to Britain, what's being done to prevent them coming back?
Well, I think it's important to empower the intelligence and security service to recognise those individuals who are at danger, to be able to ensure that working with our allies that we're able to prevent them causing the harm, the violence and the hurt that they wish to. And intelligence cooperation is critical to ensuring that those people who have been radicalised don't pose a threat to life and limb in this country or elsewhere in Europe.
Sadly today, Michael, we're seeing an alarming increase in the rise of anti-Semitism, yes, both in Britain and also in Europe. What is being done to protect this very precious community of ours, the Jewish community?
Well, one of the great things that Theresa May has done is that she's embraced a definition of anti-Semitism, which makes it quite clear that those people who attempt either to blacken the name of the State of Israel or to target Jewish people collectively should be called out for that prejudice. And I think it's fantastic that Britain is leading the world in the fight against anti-Semitism. There's still an enormous amount to do because the return of anti-Semitism, sometimes in the guise of anti-Zionism, is one of the great moral challenges of our time. I'm glad that we have a Prime Minister who's equal to that challenge.
Michael, you're a great friend of Israel and the Jewish nation, and you know, when we see the security threats facing Israel, from a nuclear Iran to the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement to Israel's international legitimacy, and also being forced a unilateral Palestinian state on Israel's borders. how can we defend the one true democracy in the Middle East?
Well, you're absolutely right to point out that Israel is the only really robust democracy in the Middle East. There are other countries that are, oriented towards peace, but they're not yet fully democracies. I think one of the things that we can all do is to stand by Israel, to call out people behind the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions campaign, to point out that it is in effect an attempt to delegitimize the Jewish state and to undermine the security and to attack the identity of the Jewish people collectively. And I think by confronting and calling out that prejudice, we can ensure that we're doing our bit to stand shoulder to shoulder with Democrats everywhere.
Absolutely, and what we've seen in over the last few months, in particular, is work being carried out by UNESCO to deny the Jewish rights to their capital city, which is Jerusalem, including the Western Wall and the Jewish quarter of the Old City, by saying this is Palestinian occupied territories, when for thousands of years there's identification between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, which is being denied in the international arena. How can we combat the anti-bias against Israel in the United Nations and also in UNESCO?
I think one of the challenges the United Nations has is to ensure that it's not captured by people with a particular political agenda, often an anti-Israel agenda. We've seen that in the past with resolutions, for example, equating Zionism with racism. And the important thing is to make sure that we support, whether it's Nikki Haley, the American ambassador to the UN, or our own ambassador to the UN, in calling this out. It's an ongoing struggle to ensure that that assembly, which has within it voices that are hostile to Israel, also hears from people who can call out that prejudice and defend democracy.
And regarding the Palestinian Authority itself, now we know with their education system and their media that they are inciting their people and particularly their young children to become suicide bombers through their education system, through their media as well. And this is going to do nothing to advance the long-term peace situation. Surely this is something that Britain, being a world player, can place pressure on the Palestinian Authority to stop this incitement to hate and glorification of violence.
Absolutely, and I know that both the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development have been very clear that this sort of incitement needs to stop.
In terms of probably the biggest foreign policy challenge of our generation, and that is a nuclear Iran. If Iran reaches nuclear threshold and acquires the nuclear weapon, surely this not only poses a danger to Israel, but also poses a danger to the entire region of the Middle East and also in Europe. How essential is it that, in terms of international security, that Iran is not allowed to actually acquire nuclear weapons?
I think that if Iran did acquire nuclear weapons, that could generate an arms race across the Middle East, which would not contribute to peace and stability. So it's very, very important the international community works to ensure that Iran remains some distance away from acquiring nuclear weapons, which would destabilize the Middle East and the broader region.
Sadly today we see that the Christian minorities in the Middle East are on the verge of being ethnically cleansed and by ISIS and other Islamist terrorist organisations. In the extent there's actually essentially genocide. And now, why has it been so slow for so many Western governments to recognise the genocide that's taking place against these ancient Christian communities in the Middle East?
I think the situation in the Middle East is in so many respects tragic, but you're absolutely right to say that there are some countries which are engaging in persecution towards minorities, and Christian minority populations in a number of countries are suffering. Our hearts go out to them, but I must commend the work of the Archbishop of Canterbury and others in drawing their plight to our attention, and it's certainly something I know that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are worried about and wish to act on.
In the post-EU era that Britain now finds herself in, how important is it, the transatlantic relationship and partnership between Britain and the United States?
Whatever one might think of any individual American president, and not everyone will support everyone who's occupied that office, it's really important that Britain and America stay friends. We have a shared democratic heritage, which means that when we work together, the world is a safer place for freedom.
And Michael, I'll just give you a kind of final question. Why should our viewers vote Conservative at this general election?
I think in Theresa May we have an outstanding national leader, someone who's guided by an ethical and moral framework that is impeccable. And she's also someone who's proven herself, not just in her 6 years as Home Secretary, but in the last year as Prime Minister, to be a leader of real stature. The other individuals who are leading political parties simply can't compare with her. So whatever people's past voting history, I think that Theresa stands out as someone who is head and shoulders above her competitors and the right person to put your faith in for the next 5 years.
Michael Gove, I want to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity today to interview you for June the 8th general election.
Thank you so much. Thank you.